Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here, and tonight I want to tell you about the most absurd international incident in American history, a territorial dispute between the United States and Great Britain that nearly erupted into full-scale war because one American farmer shot one British pig. I'm talking about the Pig War of 1859, a standoff that lasted 12 years, involved hundreds of soldiers and naval vessels from two world powers, and resulted in exactly one casualty, the pig. This is the story of how a dead hog on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest almost reignited the War of 1812, and how cooler heads eventually prevailed over what has to be the dumbest reason for a war in human history. Let me take you back to 1859, to the San Juan Islands, a beautiful archipelago sitting in the waters between what's now Washington State and Vancouver Island, British Columbia. These islands were caught in a geographic and political limbo. After the War of 1812, the United States and Britain had settled most of their border disputes, drawing the line at the 49th parallel across the continent. But when they got to the Pacific coast, the treaty language got vague. The border was supposed to follow the main channel through the strait separating the continent from Vancouver Island. Problem was, there were two main channels, and the San Juan Islands sat right between them. The Americans claimed the border ran through Rosario Strait, which would put the San Juan Islands in U.S. territory. The British claimed it ran through Haro Strait, which would make the islands British. And for more than a decade, both sides just sort of ignored the problem, with citizens of both nations settling on the islands while their governments argued about who actually owned the place. It was a recipe for disaster, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came in the form of a large black boar, property of the Hudson's Bay Company, the British fur trading company that had been operating in the Pacific Northwest for decades. The Hudson's Bay Company ran a sheep farm on San Juan Island, employing Irishman Charles Griffin as their operations manager. Griffin had this pig, and like most pigs, it liked to wander, root around, and eat whatever it could find. On June 15, 1859, that pig wandered into the potato patch of Lyman Cutler, an American farmer who'd settled on the island a few years earlier. Now, this wasn't the first time. Griffin's pig had been getting into Cutler's garden repeatedly, destroying his crops, eating his potatoes, which, if you know anything about frontier farming, were basically survival food. Cutler had complained to Griffin multiple times, asking him to keep his damn pig under control. Griffin had basically told him to build a better fence. The tension had been building. So, on this June morning, when Cutler looked out and saw that pig destroying his potato patch yet again, something snapped. He grabbed his rifle, walked outside, and shot the pig dead. One shot, one dead pig, and suddenly two nations were on a collision course toward war. Now, in any reasonable world, this would have been a simple property dispute. Cutler goes to Griffin, says, "I'm sorry, your pig was destroying my crops. Here's some money to compensate you," and everyone moves on. But this wasn't a reasonable situation, and these weren't reasonable times. Griffin was furious. That was valuable property, and some American had just killed it. He demanded that Cutler pay him $100 for the pig, which was an outrageous sum, way more than the pig was worth. Cutler offered $10. Griffin refused. Here's where things get complicated. Griffin went to the British authorities on the island, demanding that Cutler be arrested and tried under British law. Cutler went to the American settlers, claiming he was being persecuted by the British for defending his property on American soil. Both sides dug in. The British insisted this was their territory and their laws applied. The Americans insisted it was their territory and British law had no standing. The pig, dead in Cutler's potato patch, had become an international incident. The American settlers on San Juan Island started getting nervous. They were outnumbered by the British presence, and if the Hudson's Bay Company decided to enforce British law, there wasn't much they could do about it. So, they petitioned the U.S. military for protection. The petition made its way to Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon, who was stationed down in Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. Now, General Harney was not a diplomat. He was a hardliner, an aggressive military man who believed in American expansion and wasn't about to let British settlers push American settlers around. He was also operating without clear orders from Washington, D.C., which was 3,000 miles away and 3 weeks of communication time distant. So Harney made a command decision. He ordered Captain George Pickett, yes, that George Pickett who'd later become infamous for Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, to take Company D of the 9th U.S. Infantry to San Juan Island and protect American interests. On July 27, 1859, Pickett landed on San Juan Island with 64 American soldiers. He set up camp on a bluff overlooking the south end of the island, raised the American flag, and sent word to the British authorities that the United States was taking possession of San Juan Island and would defend American settlers against British interference. Pickett, who was as aggressive as his commanding officer, reportedly told his men they were there to protect American citizens and should resist all attempts of interference by the British authorities. The British, understandably, were not happy about American soldiers suddenly occupying what they considered British territory. The governor of the colony of Vancouver Island, James Douglas, was outraged. He ordered British Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines to land Marines on San Juan Island and remove the American forces. Baines dispatched 3 British warships, HMS Tribune, HMS Satellite, and HMS Plumper, to the waters around San Juan Island. By early August, the situation was escalating rapidly. Pickett's force had grown to nearly 500 American soldiers with artillery. The British had 3 warships offshore with 2,140 men and 167 guns. Both sides were fortifying their positions, digging in, preparing for what looked like an inevitable clash. The Americans had their cannons pointed at the British ships. The British had their naval guns trained on the American encampment. Everyone was on edge, fingers on triggers, waiting for someone to make the first move. And all of it, over a dead pig. The standoff became known to locals and soldiers as the Pig War, and everyone involved seemed to recognize the absurdity even as they prepared to fight. But absurd or not, this was a dangerous situation. You had hundreds of armed men from 2 nations facing off, both sides under orders to defend their positions, both sides feeling like backing down would mean surrendering national honor and territorial claims. Wars have started over less. The key figure in preventing actual bloodshed was Rear Admiral Baines, the British naval commander. He received orders from Governor Douglas to land Marines and evict the Americans by force if necessary, but Baines looked at the situation and made a crucial decision. He wasn't going to start a war with the United States over a pig. He reportedly told Douglas 2 great nations in a war over a squabble over a pig was unacceptable, and he refused to engage unless the Americans fired first. This was enormous. Baines had the firepower to obliterate the American position. His warships could have shelled the American camp into rubble before Pickett's artillery could do much damage in return. But he held his fire, kept his ships at a distance, and waited for cooler heads in Washington and London to sort this out. On the American side, things were more complicated. General Harney was pushing for confrontation, sending more troops and supplies to reinforce Pickett. But word of the crisis had finally reached Washington, D.C., and President James Buchanan was horrified. The last thing Buchanan needed, with the country already tearing itself apart over slavery and heading towards civil war, was a shooting war with Great Britain. He sent Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army and a distinguished diplomat, to the Pacific Northwest to defuse the situation. He arrived in October 1859 and immediately recognized the insanity of what was happening. He met with British authorities and negotiated a compromise. Both nations would maintain a military presence on San Juan Island, but it would be a token force, not the hundreds of soldiers currently facing off. The agreement called for each side to station no more than 100 men on the island, while the 2 governments negotiated a permanent settlement of the border dispute. This became known as the Joint Military Occupation of San Juan Island, and it's one of the strangest military arrangements in history. The British established a camp at the north end of the island. The Americans maintained their camp at the south end. For 12 years, soldiers from 2 nations that had recently been at war shared an island, tried to ignore each other, and waited for their governments to figure out who actually owned the place. It was remarkably peaceful. The British soldiers and American soldiers would occasionally interact, sometimes socially. They'd trade goods, share news, even celebrate holidays together on occasion. There were sporting competitions between the camps. The officers would sometimes dine together. It was the most cordial military standoff in history. Two groups of professional soldiers who understood that the real enemy wasn't each other. It was boredom and isolation on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest. Life on San Juan Island during the joint occupation settled into a routine. The British built a substantial camp at Garrison Bay on the north end, with barracks, a commissary, a hospital, a formal garden. The Americans improved their camp at American Camp on the south end, building more permanent structures, a parade ground, officers' quarters. Both camps became small military communities, with soldiers rotating in and out, following orders, maintaining readiness for a war that everyone knew probably wasn't going to happen. And all the while, the pig that started it all was long since eaten or buried, its role in history complete. The border dispute finally got resolved in 1872, 13 years after Cutler shot Griffin's pig. The United States and Great Britain agreed to submit the question to international arbitration. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany was chosen as the